Today we're going to be making some life-size food items for our art project. Now today, while you're working, I'm really going to be assessing your cutting and your gluing skills. So you want to make sure that you're doing your best cutting and using the tiniest, teeniest amount of glue possible. You do not want your glue to be showing from underneath all of your cut shapes. I also have some other tips for you that will really help you as you work today. Now, some of you, friends, might like to draw your shapes out before you cut them. This is a really good idea because you can make sure that it looks right before you cut it out, because once you cut, you can't really go back, right? So if you're one of those people that like to draw your shape before you cut it, like I did here on this fried egg, you're going to want to make sure that you do not see the pencil lines on your art project. This gray pencil isn't really a very nice looking thing to have on your food pieces. The pencil is really just more of a tool to help you get the shapes right. So instead of trying to erase all of this, I usually find that it's really helpful once I cut an item out, I can just flip it over and use the back side. This is just as good of an egg, but it doesn't have any of that pencil showing around the edge, okay? Now, another thing that I want you to think about, I want you to have at least 2 colors of construction paper on each food item. So for example, on my egg, I can add a yellow circle for the yolk. I also made some bacon here. What can I put on my bacon that's gonna make it look a little more realistic? Well, I got another lighter color of brown, and I'm gonna put those little brown line shapes, I guess they're not really lines, they're more like a squiggle shape. And I'm gonna add those around my bacon to make it look a little bit more like real bacon, okay? Now these pieces are really, really small, so when I twist open my glue, I only need to add the tiniest amount of glue on here. I'm just barely squeezing and just kind of smearing on a little tiny bit, okay? So I don't need to be making actual dots, definitely not making big globs of glue. I'm just smearing that little tiny bit on. Not even really squeezing. Okay, and then if I need to trim a little bit, I can do that. Okay, so once we have our 2 pieces of construction paper, you might need to add more details. Now, of course, if you want to add more construction paper, you absolutely can. That construction paper has beautiful bright colors, and you can add as many details with it as you need. However, if you have some things that are kind of tiny, you might want to consider using some oil pastels to go along with your item. So one of the items that I made was a strawberry. I've used my 2 colors of construction paper, but to make it look a little bit more realistic, I'm gonna add those little tiny seeds with pastel. So just very carefully, I'm gonna make those dots. These would have been kind of hard to do with paper. And it makes it really look more like the texture of a strawberry. I might even put a few white dots on this side, like they're little shiny seeds. There we go. I can also make my leaves look more realistic by adding maybe some of the veins in the leaves, maybe outlining some of my leaf shapes, like so. There we go. Another item I was working on is a pancake. Now this really doesn't look like much of a pancake yet. It's a little bit plain. And so I was thinking about putting some butter and syrup on it. Now I have the butter cut out of construction paper, but I didn't really want to do the syrup out of construction paper because I thought that wouldn't look right. Syrup is kind of a transparent type of thing. So I was thinking it might be better to use a little bit of really light colored oil pastel to make it look a little more like syrup. So let's see how that turns out. I'm just gonna do a really light sort of squiggly freeform shape. and then lightly, not hard, because oil pastel can be really dark if you push hard with it. I'm just going to do a very, very light coloring over my syrup shape. So now that I have my syrup shape colored, I'm going to take my little rounded edge squares of butter, and I'm going to use some very, very tiny glue dots to put those on. And then the very last thing that I'm going to do that I think really kind of makes a big difference on some of our food items, I'm going to kind of look for some of the places where my food might be wet, like syrup is a wet object of food. The butter can kind of be wet and it looks kind of shiny sometimes when it's wet. So I like to take a little white oil pastel and just create a tiny little dashed line on some of my shinier food items, kind of like around the edge. So like on this syrup, I can kind of put a few little dashed lines around the edges of my syrup shape. And that'll make it kind of look like it's wet and kind of shiny. I did the same thing on the yolk of my egg. Kind of just helps it to look more realistic. So remember today, we are using at least 2 pieces of construction paper, 2 colors of construction paper for each item. We don't want any pencil lines showing around the edges. We're using teeny tiny amounts of glue and using our oil pastels for the small details.